what I want to talk about is the extent to which ALEC represents an instance of what we're now sort of calling new governance. And by new governance, I mean these new modalities of governance that are occurring, and I'm going to go into some of these in more detail, from government to governance, and even from a sort of Foucaultian sense to governmentality, which is that way in which we become governed in the way that I was being governed at LaGuardia Airport, right? In which our very subjectivities become changed in the ways we think about what we do. And some of my other work that I'm doing on the new professional, for example, is beginning to show how, as professionals, we are moving from occupational-oriented professionalism in which we as professionals sort of determine, as a professional group, our own sense of ethics and compliance and so on, to a kind of organizational professionalization in which professionals are increasingly not controlled through their own professional organizations, but rather through their work organizations and through the various kinds of compliance that comes from outside the profession, right? And so there's a very subtle shift in how we think about being a professional. New policy actors and entrepreneurs that are on the scene that were not there 20, 30 years ago are having a tremendous influence. And new political and discursive strategies, which was our main focus. Liliana Montoro Doncic was the doc student who worked with me on this. And our main concern here was with these political and discursive strategies. So we didn't actually do a network analysis of ALEC. In other words, its place within these larger networks, although we are now working with some other doc students on a study of the State Policy Network, which is a network of state-level think tanks, at least one in every state. The one here in Wisconsin is the Wisconsin Policy Research Institute, I think. And if you go back and look at some of the stuff they were publishing and working on about a year and a half, 2 years before the anti-labor laws came through, you can see that there was a lot of groundwork being laid by that organization, and I'm sure others, around getting that impact through those laws through the local legislature. What I mean by new modalities of governance have to do with these issues like steering from a distance through performance monitoring. So, for example, power now operates more directly through steering from a distance rather than sort of bureaucratic control, the old-fashioned public bureaucracy. We now have the system steered from a distance through these new high-stakes tests and so forth. So what we used to think of as educational organizations as loosely coupled systems are now increasingly tightly coupled systems, and they're tightly coupled through these new technologies of power that operate at a distance. So in other words, the teacher is controlled not by supervisors or inspectors, but rather by these new technologies of power that get behind the classroom door, go directly to the classroom through their requirement to respond and comply to the rigors of testing. The field of educational leadership hasn't quite figured it out yet, but really, leadership becomes more and more irrelevant once the system becomes steered in that way, because the principal's job now becomes one of A, compliance, and B, in a marketized system, public relations. And their sort of educational function becomes really sort of emptied out. Public-private partnerships, in a sense, you could say ALEC is a kind of public-private partnership with the corporate and the legislatures internally. New policy networks that are forming, both locally and globally, made up and funded by venture philanthropy. More and more billionaires, because of changes in the tax codes and so forth, with money to spend, with political agendas, influencing not only elections, because we think about corporate influence through Citizens United and more money being put into elections. But what ALEC represents is a more subtle form of corporate control in which they're actually sitting with legislators and getting the laws passed through state legislatures. And in education, of course, we spend a lot of time looking at federal level policy, No Child Left Behind, Race to the Top, et cetera, when in fact, you know, the real action to some extent is happening at the state levels, not necessarily at the federal level.